King Charles spent a short period of time in hospital today.
King Charles had to spend a short time in hospital today. Buckingham Palace is reeling tonight under the weight of two devastating storms, one medical, one moral. New insider reports allege that Queen Camilla has quietly withdrawn from the king's care just as His Majesty's health took a critical downturn, igniting a wave of fury across Britain and sparking questions no royal aide dares answer aloud. Has the Queen Consort abandoned her duty and her husband in pursuit of power? It began with an unusually short palace statement, a mere 3 sentences that shattered the illusion of calm. Behind the polished words lay chaos. King Charles's condition has entered a new phase. Sources confirm that phrase was not routine. It was the royal code for an irreversible decline. Within minutes, the palace press office flooded with calls. Reporters demanded clarification. Was the king stable? Was treatment still possible? But the most haunting question came from within. Where was Camilla? The Queen Consort, who has long projected the image of a steadfast partner, was nowhere near Balmoral when the king's medical team raised the alarm late Tuesday night. Instead, she remained at Clarence House, reportedly taking time for reflection. That phrase, too, sent shockwaves. It was not the language of love or duty, it was the language of distance. Palace aides, speaking on condition of anonymity, describe a stunning reversal of roles. It was Catherine, not Camilla, who stepped in. She was the one coordinating briefings, calling Anne, contacting the physicians. The Princess of Wales effectively became the emotional and operational center of the monarchy overnight. The revelation struck at the heart of public sentiment. In living rooms across the country, Camilla's silence was interpreted as betrayal. As morning broke, broadcasters carried images of Catherine leaving Windsor for Balmoral, poised, focused, visibly exhausted, while Camilla's car was photographed, leaving the city for an undisclosed destination. By sunrise, hashtags like #Where is Camilla and #Stand with Catherine were trending across British social media. In the words of one senior commentator, this was the moment the Queen Consort lost the room. The palace itself was in disarray. What should have been a night of medical coordination turned into a political crisis. Royal household staff were split into 2 camps. One loyal to William and Catherine, who had quietly assumed responsibility for public communication, and another still bound to Camilla's private office, which had gone silent since the night before. Even veteran courtiers were stunned by the Queen's absence. One official, visibly shaken, told the BBC off record, "We had prepared every protocol, every possible announcement, except for the Queen not showing up. That wasn't in the book, not once." For decades, the monarchy has survived scandal through unity. But now, the illusion of unity was gone. The atmosphere inside Buckingham was described by insiders as frozen chaos, everyone moving, yet no one in control. Amid the confusion, Princess Anne arrived quietly at Balmoral, as she always does, without motorcade, without cameras, just purpose. Her presence, aides say, brought a breath of composure into a house trembling under fear and frustration. Anne's arrival also added weight to the whispers that she, not Camilla, had become the king's most trusted confidant in recent months. The real breaking point came hours later, when a confidential memo circulated among the senior staff. The note, written under the king's letterhead but reportedly drafted by William's team, read, "The continuity of duty and compassion must remain unwavering." To seasoned royal watchers, this was no ordinary statement, it was a direct rebuke. Compassion was the missing word in every description of Camilla's behavior. By the afternoon, the story was no longer about the king's health, it was about the Queen's absence. Television analysts began replaying old footage, drawing contrasts between Camilla's polished public smiles and Catherine's quiet constancy. One segment showed Catherine comforting a nurse during a cancer ward visit earlier this year, juxtaposed against Camilla laughing at a polo event weeks later. The contrast was brutal and effective, but perhaps the most damaging blow came not from the media, but from within the palace itself. A senior aide leaked that Camilla had privately refused to travel to Balmoral, citing emotional exhaustion. When pressed, she allegedly told staff, "I can't face that room again. Let them handle it. Let them handle it." Those 4 words reverberated like a slap across the monarchy's face. To a nation already anxious about its king, this was unforgivable. Royal historian Dr. Stephen White described it bluntly on live television. When the late Queen was gravely ill, her family rallied around her. What we're seeing now is the opposite, and the public will not forget who stepped back and who stepped forward. Even veteran correspondents, usually cautious with language, began using words once unthinkable for a sitting Queen Consort: neglect, distance, ambition. Meanwhile, the king himself remained under observation, surrounded not by his wife, but by his son, his sister, and the woman the nation now sees as its moral compass, Princess Catherine. According to insiders, it was Catherine who read the morning briefings aloud to Charles. It was she who ensured privacy protocols were upheld. And it was she who comforted Anne when reports turned grim. "The princess didn't come as a daughter-in-law," said one aide quietly. "She came as the daughter he always wished Diana could see." Outside the palace, the crowds swelled. Thousands left flowers and letters not just for the king but for Catherine, thanking her for her grace when others faltered. One card pinned to the gates read simply, "She stood up when the queen sat down." As night fell, the moral tide had turned. Camilla's office issued a single-sentence statement claiming she was monitoring the situation privately. But for many, it was too late. The damage was done. In the eyes of the public, the queen consort had crossed an invisible line from consort to opportunist, from partner to political survivor. And with every passing hour of silence, the nation's sympathy shifted decisively toward the Wallaces. At Balmoral, under dim lights and relentless press helicopters, William reportedly held his father's hand and whispered, "We'll carry this for you." And somewhere far from the cameras, Camilla was said to be drafting letters not to doctors or advisors, but to her own private circle, quietly calculating how to survive the storm she had created. The clock had just passed midnight at Balmoral Castle when the air inside the king's private wing turned heavy with unease. For weeks, whispers had circulated among the medical teams something wasn't right. The king's strength had waned faster than predicted, and the latest test results confirmed what many had feared. His condition had entered a dangerous stage. At 12:47 a.m., a royal physician placed a discreet call through the emergency line reserved only for moments of national significance. Within 20 minutes, 3 senior aides, 2 doctors, and Prince William were assembled in the crisis room, a space once used for war briefings during Queen Elizabeth's reign. The only person missing was Camilla. Her absence was noted in silence. No one dared speak it aloud, but every glance across that oak-paneled room carried the same question. "Where is she?" A senior advisor finally broke the tension. "Her Majesty has decided to remain at Clarence House," he said, his voice unsteady. "She sends her thoughts. She sends her thoughts." That phrase hung in the air like smoke. William lowered his gaze, nodding once. Princess Anne, standing beside him in a simple coat, did not hide her disapproval. "Thoughts?" she murmured sharply. "What His Majesty needs is presence." The meeting that followed was tense and unplanned, a rare breach of palace order. Decisions normally filtered through the private secretary were made directly by William and Anne. The king's doctors confirmed that Charles's condition had worsened significantly overnight, prompting emergency treatment measures that required round-the-clock supervision. Under normal circumstances, this duty would fall to the queen consort. Instead, it was Catherine who answered the call. At 2:10 a.m., she arrived quietly at Balmoral, her convoy of just 2 cars slipping past reporters stationed near the gates. Dressed in a navy coat and low heels, she carried no entourage, no dramatics, only a folder and a look of calm determination. One aide described the moment she entered the king's chamber. She didn't flinch. She took His Majesty's hand and said, "You're not alone, sir." It wasn't grand, it was human. From that moment, the crisis turned into coordination. Catherine liaised directly with the medical staff, cross-checking treatment instructions, ensuring confidentiality protocols were followed. Meanwhile, William was in the adjoining room drafting an updated communication plan for the palace press team. The language had to strike a balance. Reassurance without deceit. By dawn, the Wallaces and Princess Anne had done what the palace machinery could not restore order through sheer composure. But beyond the castle walls, the narrative had already begun to shift. While Catherine was quietly tending to the king, Camilla's name had vanished from internal schedules. The press office confirmed she had no public duties planned for the week, an odd decision considering the monarch's deteriorating health. Inside the palace, aides exchanged uneasy glances. Some speculated she had retreated out of grief. Others, more cynical, whispered she was waiting to see how the balance of power would fall. A high-ranking source told the Times, "It was clear to everyone that Catherine was carrying the emotional weight." Camilla's office didn't even send staff to Balmoral. It was a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped the Princess of Wales. The contrast could not have been starker. Catherine's compassion was spontaneous and uncalculated. Camilla's absence was strategic and chilling. By midday, news outlets were flooded with commentary. Royal experts noted that this was the first major crisis of Charles's reign where the queen consort had not appeared at his side. Even foreign press began questioning the optics. One French headline captured the public mood bluntly: "La reine s'efface et la princesse s'élève." The queen disappears and the princess rises. Inside Balmoral, William and Anne met privately with the king's physician. The prognosis was grim. The king was conscious but weak, requesting that all official duties be temporarily deferred. William was instructed to oversee transitional duties, a phrase later confirmed to have been written in the king's own hand. For the first time, William held functional control over the monarchy. Anne, ever the realist, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do what must be done, William. Father would want continuity, not collapse." And while the future monarch carried the weight of that responsibility, the queen consort's behavior grew harder to justify. Multiple palace insiders confirmed that Camilla had requested her personal staff refrain from issuing any public comment, fearing that an appearance of panic would undermine stability. Yet by choosing silence, she achieved the opposite. Television panels tore apart her decision. One commentator summarized what millions were thinking. "This is not just absence, it's abandonment." That evening, the gates of Balmoral filled once again. Citizens, tourists, and royal supporters gathered under gray skies, holding candles and photographs. Many came not only for the king, but for the Princess of Wales, the woman seen as holding the monarchy together. As reporters called out for updates, Catherine stepped briefly outside to greet the waiting crowd. She offered no speech, just a quiet wave and a line that echoed through newsrooms worldwide. "He's resting now, we'll take care of him." The simplicity of her words struck a nerve. Within hours, newspapers across Britain printed her photo on the front page beside a single headline: "Duty in silence." In contrast, Camilla's image was buried deep within the back pages, described as isolated, inaccessible, and increasingly detached. Her public approval rating plunged overnight. Even conservative commentators who once defended her role began to waver. One wrote candidly, "The Queen has gone missing when her people and her husband needed her most. History may forgive her, the public won't." Inside Balmoral, the divide had crystallized into two distinct realities. In one wing of the castle, Catherine and Anne coordinated medical care and communication. In another, a portrait of Camilla hung above an empty desk, flowers wilting in its vase. By midnight, even the most loyal courtiers could no longer ignore the shift. The monarchy's heart was still beating, but it was Catherine's hand keeping the rhythm. By the third night at Balmoral, the royal corridors no longer hummed with routine. They buzzed with purpose, William's purpose. What began as an emergency response had quietly evolved into a transition of power. With King Charles confined to his private suite, weakened but lucid, William took command of daily briefings. He reviewed medical updates, approved statements, and personally oversaw the palace's crisis communication. Every decision bore his handwriting, calm, steady, and unmistakably royal. Courtiers whispered that he no longer waited for instructions, he gave them. Princess Anne stood at his side, lending legitimacy and quiet strength. Catherine, meanwhile, managed what the monarchy had long neglected: empathy. Her presence softened the tension that had settled like fog over the palace. Each photograph of her leaving the king's room or addressing staff carried the same message: duty had found its true heir. But in London, a very different energy was taking shape. Camilla had vanished from the public eye entirely. Her private secretary was instructed to decline interviews, cancel appearances, and avoid fueling speculation. Yet every refusal only deepened suspicion. When word leaked that the Queen Consort had declined to attend an internal meeting about Charles's condition, outrage erupted. The public, already on edge, saw it as proof of selfishness. One newspaper headline read simply, "Britain asks, where is the Queen?" Inside the palace, the consequences were immediate. Aides who once belonged to Camilla's inner circle began shifting allegiance toward William. Some offered to brief him directly, others discreetly shared her correspondence with senior advisors. What had once been loyalty was now damage control. An insider described the shift bluntly: when the Queen retreated, the future king advanced. There was no power grab, just a vacuum, and he filled it. The symbolic turning point came when the Privy Council met remotely that Friday. Traditionally, the Queen Consort would attend as the monarch's support. This time, it was Catherine seated beside William on the video call. The optics were impossible to ignore. In those 20 minutes, the image of the monarchy changed, not through decree or coronation, but through quiet competence. Catherine represented composure. William represented command. Together, they embodied stability at a moment when the crown's heart was failing. Camilla, watching from afar, reportedly felt blindsided. Palace sources say she erupted in anger after realizing the Wallaces had appeared in her place. Yet even her frustration carried no authority. The tide of public perception had already turned. Royal historian Dr. Martin Hale noted on air, "This is how modern transitions happen, not in ceremony, but in confidence. When one figure falters, another simply takes the stage." Oh, and as the nation lit candles for the king, television broadcasts began referring to William and Catherine as the steady hands of the monarchy. The phrasing, though subtle, marked a seismic shift in tone. Within days, what had begun as an illness became something larger, a reckoning. The monarchy was evolving in real time, and for the first time since Queen Elizabeth's passing, the British people felt a sense of direction. In that clarity, Camilla's shadow began to fade. Her silence was no longer strategic, it was irrelevant. The silence from Clarence House could no longer be mistaken for grief. It was calculation, and it was about to erupt. After nearly a week of seclusion, Queen Camilla resurfaced. Not in person, but through paper. Multiple palace sources confirm she had begun sending a series of handwritten letters to senior courtiers and sympathetic journalists, messages that blurred the line between private defense and public manipulation. In these letters, Camilla portrayed herself as the misunderstood guardian of the monarchy. "I have stood by His Majesty when others turned away." One note reportedly read, "I am not withdrawing, I am preserving dignity." But inside the palace, few believed her words matched her actions. The first leak came from within her own circle. A staff member, alarmed by her tone, confided that the Queen Consort's messages were filled with resentment, especially toward Catherine. In one letter, she described the Princess of Wales as a well-meaning woman who oversteps boundaries. Another, even harsher line called her too eager to please the cameras. By dawn, the tabloids had their headline, "Camilla's Private Fury, the Letters She Never Wanted You to Read." The backlash was instant and fierce. For the first time since her marriage to Charles, the Queen Consort faced open public condemnation. Television panels condemned her cold opportunism, while social media accused her of attacking the only person holding the monarchy together. At Balmoral, the reaction was equally sharp. Princess Anne, always blunt, reportedly said during a briefing, "When the nation prays for one's husband, one does not write letters, one packs a bag and goes to him." William, though outwardly calm, was said to be furious. The timing of the leak had reignited turmoil just as his father's condition had stabilized slightly. "She turned sympathy into scandal," one aide whispered. Every ounce of goodwill the monarchy had rebuilt was suddenly at risk. It was Catherine who insisted the palace remain silent. Her reasoning was simple. If we dignify it with a response, we become chaotic. Her restraint only deepened the contrast between the two women. While Camilla's name filled gossip columns, Catherine's quiet visits to local hospitals, her gentle waves to crowds outside Balmoral, and her unwavering devotion to the king transformed her into a living emblem of duty. Behind closed doors, however, the damage was real. The king's health updates, once tightly controlled, began to leak brief fragments of truth twisted by speculation. Camilla's allies inside the communications team were accused of selectively feeding details to sympathetic reporters. One particularly inflammatory article suggested the king's decline was exaggerated to strengthen William's claim to authority, a claim immediately dismissed by palace insiders as fiction crafted to serve personal insecurity. It was the first time in modern royal history that a sitting queen consort's behavior was being described internally as destabilizing. Au fait, aides quietly began referring to the two camps by code names: the crown room, William and Catherine, and the drawing room, Camilla's circle. The tension was no longer whispered, it was institutional. One senior official confessed, the late queen built 70 years of unity. In 7 days, Camilla nearly broke it. As the storm intensified, William made a rare public appearance. Standing before cameras at Windsor, he thanked the nation for its patience and faith. He never mentioned Camilla, but his closing line, "We will serve as one family, as His Majesty would wish," carried a deliberate emphasis on we, not she. That evening, Camilla finally appeared in public alone. Dressed in black, her expression tightly composed, she attended a brief church service near London. The gesture, likely meant to project dignity, backfired spectacularly. Cameras captured her walking past royal well-wishers without acknowledgement. A single clip of her turning away from a child offering flowers went viral within hours. By nightfall, British media had declared the verdict: the Queen Consort has lost the nation. Meanwhile, inside Balmoral, King Charles, weak but alert, was briefed on the fallout. A source close to the king revealed that he closed his eyes and asked for peace, not defense. He reportedly told his doctor, "If she cannot stand by me, she must stand down." And dit-on. Those words, though never formally recorded, would echo through every corner of the palace in the days to follow. The monarchy was now a divided house. Camilla's retreat, her letters, her missteps all had isolated her. And yet, for all her errors, she refused to yield. She began lobbying quietly for influence over future appointments, arguing that stability requires continuity. But for many courtiers, the phrase continuity had become synonymous with Camilla clinging to relevance. Catherine, by contrast, never spoke a word about the queen. She didn't need to. Each act of kindness, a brief smile to a nurse, a patient explanation to the press, a hand placed gently on the king's shoulder said everything that needed saying. As historian Simon Drew summarized during a late-night broadcast, it's not about crowns or titles anymore. It's about who carries grace when the kingdom trembles. And right now, that grace belongs entirely to Catherine. By the week's end, Camilla's influence had collapsed into whispers, and her name had become shorthand for detachment. The queen consort who once sought power now found herself battling irrelevance, while the woman she once overshadowed stood illuminated by the nation's trust. At Balmoral, the staff began a new habit when closing each day's logbook. Where the column once read Her Majesty overseeing duties, it now bore 5 quiet words that marked a royal transition in motion. The Princess of Wales present. It was 7 p.m. London time when the broadcast began. Across the United Kingdom, televisions flickered to life. Curtains were drawn, living rooms fell silent, and the image of King Charles III appeared frail, pale, yet composed in a way that commanded reverence. For weeks, the nation had waited to hear from him. Now, as his voice trembled through the airwaves, Britain braced for the truth. My health has been a test, he began softly, pausing between words. But it is not mine alone. It belongs to all who love this country and all who carry its future. Those who had feared the worst could hear it in his tone. This was not just an update. It was a farewell disguised as gratitude. He spoke of service, of the late Queen's example, and of the fragility of leadership. His eyes lowered briefly, and the camera captured the faint glint of tears. Then, in a moment that would dominate headlines for days, Charles mentioned Catherine by name. The Princess of Wales, he said, has shown a strength of spirit and a kindness that reminds me of the best in us and of the woman who shaped us all. It was the first time in decades that the king had spoken openly of Diana's influence. The mention was deliberate, a gesture of reconciliation, and a silent acknowledgement that Catherine had become the embodiment of what the monarchy must now be. The camera cut briefly to Windsor Castle, where William and Catherine were watching from a private study. Staff later said she wiped away a tear, whispering, "He didn't have to do that." The broadcast continued for 15 more minutes, but it was the undercurrent, not the words, that moved the world. When Charles thanked those who serve with quiet dignity, viewers knew exactly whom he meant. Then came the moment that silenced even the most cynical observers. "In the coming months," Charles said, his voice quivering, "my son, the Prince of Wales, will assume greater responsibilities as I once did for my mother. The crown endures not by blood alone, but by service, compassion, and faith. I have full confidence in him and in his wife." The phrasing, "the crown endures," was subtle yet seismic. It was a transfer of moral authority, if not yet formal power. Within the palace, staff exchanged knowing glances. This was the beginning of the regency in all but name. The king's eyes softened as he concluded, "We are, all of us, merely caretakers. What matters is not the hand that wears the crown, but the heart that upholds it." The screen faded to black, and in that quiet second before applause, before tears, before the storm of commentary that would follow, the British monarchy changed forever. Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds erupted into spontaneous applause. Candles were lit, church bells rang unprompted. Strangers hugged one another, whispering, "He trusts them, it's done." But the one person who did not appear, moved by the moment, was Camilla. According to multiple insiders, she watched the broadcast from Clarence House surrounded by aides, her expression stone still. When the king praised Catherine, one witness claimed she set her teacup down sharply and said only 3 words. "So, it's begun." Her staff described the atmosphere as icy. There was no statement from her office, no congratulatory message, no acknowledgement of the king's speech. For the public, that silence was confirmation of everything they already believed, that Camilla's reign, brief and brittle, was ending before it had even begun. The backlash was immediate. Columnists, politicians, and even members of parliament began calling the Waleses the future face of the monarchy. Overnight polls showed a 20-point surge in William and Catherine's approval, ratings the highest since the coronation. Meanwhile, whispers spread that senior courtiers were reassigning key staff away from Clarence House to the Kensington team. One insider called it the quiet migration of loyalty. "The institution has already made up its mind," said a royal historian on BBC One. "Camilla is yesterday's page. Catherine is tomorrow's chapter." The next morning, Catherine arrived at Buckingham to oversee a new initiative, a symbolic meeting with Commonwealth youth ambassadors that had originally been scheduled for the king. Cameras followed her every move. She smiled gently, thanked the press, and declined to speak about her father-in-law's address. Yet her presence alone was the answer. At one point, a journalist shouted, "Do you have a message for His Majesty?" Catherine paused, looked directly at the lens, and said quietly, "We're all praying for him, and we'll keep going just as he taught us." That single sentence trended across every major network. She spoke like a queen, wrote The Guardian, and the nation heard her as one. In contrast, Camilla's isolation became painfully visible. Within days, her schedule evaporated. Public appearances were canceled under the pretext of personal reflection. Aides close to her confirmed that she felt deeply wounded by the king's public praise of Catherine, viewing it as an act of emotional betrayal. Even allies in the press began to distance themselves. One columnist wrote, "Camilla had her moment. She lost it not through tragedy, but through choice." Inside Balmoral, as the king recovered in seclusion, Catherine remained by his side. She brought him tea each morning, read him the day's briefings, and coordinated updates with Anne and William. According to palace sources, Charles reportedly told Anne during a private conversation, "She's the best of us. She always was." Anne nodded, replying softly, "Mother would have said the same." And in that brief exchange between a fading king and his sister, the monarchy found something it hadn't felt in years: peace. By week's end, official photographs were released. The image showed King Charles seated beside Catherine, with William standing behind them, the unmistakable composition of a monarch, his heir, and his successor's partner. Camilla was absent. The caption beneath the image read simply, "Continuity and care." But to everyone watching, it meant something far deeper. The king had spoken and the crown had already moved on. It began quietly, no coronation, no proclamation, just a subtle rearrangement of light within the royal family. After King Charles's emotional address, the transformation became visible everywhere. In the tone of public discourse, in the way the palace issued statements, and most of all, in the faces that represented Britain to the world. Catherine was now the center. Her portrait, released by the palace days later, showed her in pale blue, serene, strong, unadorned. Beneath it, the caption read, "For service, for people, for the crown." It wasn't a title, yet it carried more weight than any crown could. Crowds gathered outside Kensington Palace every morning, leaving cards addressed simply, "To our future queen." Across the nation, news anchors spoke of her composure and grace, describing her as the bridge between two eras. Even foreign dignitaries began directing formal correspondence to her office, citing transition protocol. Within the palace, the hierarchy was shifting fast. William chaired emergency meetings in the king's stead, while Catherine oversaw humanitarian programs once led by Queen Elizabeth herself. The machine of monarchy was quietly, efficiently, reprogramming itself around them. But in another corner of royal life, Camilla's silence deepened into absence. She retreated to Ray Mill House, the Wiltshire estate she had once called her sanctuary, citing rest and privacy. Only a few staff remained with her. Those who visited described a woman surrounded by fading portraits and unopened mail, her crown polished but untouched. "I gave everything to be seen," she reportedly said to an aide, "and now they wish I would disappear." Public sympathy was scarce. The narrative had hardened. Camilla, once viewed as a survivor, was now seen as the architect of her own downfall. Every headline compared her detachment to Catherine's devotion. One queen prays, another hides. The nation chooses grace. Oh, meanwhile, the king, frail but lucid, found solace in his family's renewed unity. In one of his final private audiences, he asked William to ensure that Catherine never loses herself to the institution. Those words, later shared by Princess Anne, encapsulated a father's final act of wisdom. And so, as autumn drew across Britain, the monarchy stood transformed, not through decree, but through example. A queen consort had faded, a princess had risen, and a king, at the twilight of his reign, had ensured that the crown would rest in steadier, purer hands. On the steps of Windsor, Catherine appeared one morning with William and their children. No ceremony, no grandeur, only sunlight breaking through the clouds. When asked how the king was doing, she smiled and said, "He's resting, and we're moving forward together." That line, replayed across every network, became the unofficial closing of a royal chapter. Camilla's name vanished from public schedules. Catherine's filled every one. The power shift that began with whispers ended with applause. And as Britain looked to the future, one truth had become clear: the age of quiet strength had begun. And its emblem was no longer the crown itself, but the woman who carried it with grace long before it was hers to wear.